Gab. I am the researcher for CUPE in the Maritimes. And today we are starting a series of videos on the provincial budget that was passed on March 29th. So in the first part of the series, we will be talking about the difference between an individual budget and a provincial budget. Because we've been hearing in the media and the government saying a lot that, you know, a government, just like a family, needs to balance the books and pay down the debt. But is that true? Like, is that really what the province needs to be doing? We'll take a moment to look at that in part one. So the first thing that we want to discuss is the difference between an individual and a government budget. And the reason why we do that is because in this provincial budget, Blaine Higgs and the Conservatives have decided that they wanted to prioritize a balanced budget and paying down the provincial debt. So in order to do those two things, they have either not increased the funds in some programs or reduced the funds in some public services and some public programs because they wanted to focus on balancing the books and on paying down the debt. So when an individual or a household does those two things, that is good because they're looking out for their finances. But what does it look like when a government does that? So in order to have a broader conversation, we wanted to just compare what the difference is between those two different types of budgeting because they are different. So one of the first things that we can look at is who is it for? So an individual budget is for the individual and maybe their family if they're budgeting for an entire household. The decisions that an individual makes will impact him or her and their family. Who is it for a government budget? It's all of us, right? It's the collective. The decisions that the government makes when it's budgeting impacts all of us in the province. Another question we can ask is, where does the revenue come from? Because in order to budget, there has to be a pot of money. We have to be able to take the money that we have and allocate it in certain things. So for an individual, that revenue comes from their wage, which depends on their employer. That means that if they see that they're not getting at the end of the week, you know, they're coming up short, the only thing that a worker or an individual can depend on is a wage increase that comes from their employer, that either they've received through negotiating with the union or that they were able to get in a contract discussion with their employer. But they are dependent on someone outside themselves to raise the amount of money that goes into their pot. Whereas a government can raise its revenue by raising taxes. And that can be, yeah, sure, personal income taxes, but we pay a lot of those in New Brunswick already. Something that the government can do, though, is raise corporate taxes for maybe some of the large corporations that we have in New Brunswick. There's two that comes to mind. And then finally, we can talk about debt, right? So when we talk about budgeting, we can also talk about debt because debt means that you spend more money than you earn. So for individuals, there's some pretty strict guidelines around how much debt you can incur, and there's consequences for that. One of the largest consequences is if you pass away with a load of debt, that debt gets passed on to your loved ones. So that's a pretty severe consequence. So I'm just going to write time limits, consequences. But when you're a province, right, you can incur a significant amount of debt for virtually an unlimited amount of time, and there aren't that many consequences. We'll talk about some of these consequences and how they're not even that bad, right? Virtually unlimited amount of time. So you can see that there are some pretty significant differences between when an individual budgets and when a government budgets. And a lot of the decisions that were made in this past budget were made because the government was afraid of the high debt load that New Brunswick as a province has. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about the debt load that we have in New Brunswick. So let's look at the New Brunswick government's debt load. So the way that we measure debt is net debt to GDP, so how much production that New Brunswick had for the year 2017-2018, so that we can compare the two. And when you compare it to all the other provinces in New Brunswick, sure, we're kind of higher up on the spectrum there, but we're really close in that, right? Like Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC are kind of outliers where their net debt to GDP ratios are pretty low at 15% or lower. But if you look between PEI and Newfoundland, there's not that much difference, about 32% going to about 42%. So it's like over this 10% threshold. And New Brunswick is kind of comfortably right in the middle there, a sandwich between PEI, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia, and then on the other end, Ontario, Quebec, and Newfoundland. So I don't think that there's really necessarily anything to be, freaking out about in terms of New Brunswick's debt. Plus, one of the reasons why people are freaking out about the New Brunswick debt would be because there's some credit rating agencies or bond rating service agencies that are giving us a bad grade. So they're saying, oh, you need to deal with the economy or else people won't want to invest in business in your province. So Blaine Higgs has said, last year the Dominion Bond Rating Service gave us a bad grade, so we need to pay down the debt in order to get a better grade. But in the newspaper a week ago, the Dominion Bond Rating Service Agency said that because of the additional budget restraint on the operating side, so because they didn't invest enough in public services, in the capital budget in particular, so construction, it might help with the debt outlook, but not the economic outlook. So we might still get a bad grade because we haven't invested enough in our public services. So you see that even when Blaine Higgs prioritizes paying down the debt, it's not giving the results that we're looking for. So stay tuned for part 2, where we will be discussing what austerity is, the austerity cycle, seeing the impact of the austerity budget on programs and services, and how, as a province, we can do better.